So hello and welcome to our first podcast, which is going to be about temporary accommodation. My name's Alan Bruzon. I'm the Chief Officer of Citizens Advice Eastbourne, and with me I have Sue Hennell.
And I'm the Senior Advice Manager for BHT Sussex.
Sue and I have worked together in the same office for a very long time, and we both help people who are in temporary accommodation and the issues around that, both before and during and after. We recently did a piece with Josh Babarindi where we had a very short period of time to talk about temporary accommodation, and then afterwards we thought it's quite an important subject with quite a lot of detail to it, so we thought, how about let's do a podcast. So this is our first experimental podcast where we're trying it out, and let's see how it goes. So we've got some questions to refer to, some things to prompt us. So let's start at the beginning then. Sue, what is temporary accommodation? How does it work?
Okay, so for people that are without a home, either because their landlord has wanted the property back or they've lost their home due to family breakdown or something like that, they can go to their local housing authority, so their local council, and if the council believes that that person may be in priority need and that they're homeless, they have a duty to provide them with emergency accommodation. And so somebody will stay there. That could be a single person who's got mental health problems or physical disabilities. It could be a family and children. It could be all sorts of different family makeups that end up in emergency accommodation. And that can't be for more than 6 weeks for a family with young children, so that they could be placed into B&B, but that can only be for 6 weeks. Then they have to be moved on to more suitable temporary accommodation. So the local authority will, during that period, be making inquiries into their homelessness application, which they will have made because they don't have accommodation of their own. And at that point, when the council have made a decision that they owe that family a full duty to assist them with housing, whether that's a single person or a family unit, then they could end up staying in the accommodation they're in, if that's deemed suitable for them, but that is then temporary accommodation. And temporary accommodation could be for a number of years. And then that's when the local authority would be looking to either assist them to rent privately, or they could be housed off of the housing register. But temporary accommodation of itself could be all sorts of different types of accommodation. It could be that emergency B&B. It could be a self-contained accommodation, which is what we would want them to be moved into. But necessarily temporary accommodation by its very nature is not supposed to be permanent accommodation, and so it's not always what we would class as suitable accommodation.
Right, so there's a lot there to unpack. That's a really good explanation to get us started. So you mentioned there that it's to do with whether the local authorities decides that they have a duty to house somebody. Mm-hmm. So in some cases they would conclude that they don't have a duty, and then what would happen? What would that person do?
Well, there would be 2 points. Either when somebody approaches the council and the council says, we don't believe that you're homeless, or we don't believe that you're eligible for assistance, or we don't believe that you may be in priority need, the council at that point doesn't have a duty to assist with temporary accommodation as they deem it. At that point, that person should be given their decision in writing, and that decision should give them the right to request a review of that decision that the council has made, but they have to put that review in within 21 days of the date of the letter, which is really, really important that gets in. If they are what we would class as somebody who is vulnerable or should be provided with emergency accommodation pending the outcome of the homelessness application, there are ways to actually sort of legally to force them to provide temporary accommodation if we deem that they are in priority need, homeless and eligible, and that would be by judicial review. And that is to show that actually we'd have to show the court that the decision the council has made is not reasonable. That doesn't happen that often, and more often than not we can speak to the council and have a discussion with them about why we believe that person should be provided with emergency accommodation. But then somebody will then end, if they're at that point, they then have to go on, the council has to go on and make a decision then whether that person is in priority need, and also whether they have made themselves intentionally homeless from their previous accommodation. And if the council can say yes, that person is homeless, they're eligible, they're in priority need, and they didn't make themselves intentionally homeless, then that council, somebody owes them a full duty. Which council owes them a full duty will be down to what local authority they've lived in. So who do they have a local connection to? So the most popular ones that people are either they've lived in that local authority area for 6 out of the last 12 months or 3 out of the last 5 years. There are other things such as special reasons, or for somebody who's fleeing domestic violence, they don't have to have a local connection to that area if it's not safe for them to return. And at that point, if they accept a full duty, then the council will have a duty to keep them housed until such time as they can offer them, help them into privately rented accommodation or accommodation via their housing register.
Right, so initially it sounds quite complicated in that the people affected have to go through a process. They're not simply going from wherever they lived into temporary accommodation. There's a kind of an entry process through the council, and there are some people who are going to get refused. So do they effectively become street homeless if they don't have friends or family to go and stay with? Is that...
If they're single people, unfortunately, a large proportion of those people will become street homeless.
Right.
I would hope that no local authority would see a child on the street. So a family with dependent children should not be homeless. Unless there are other things going on that we're not aware of, it may be that if they don't fulfil the part about being eligible for assistance, and that is that their immigration status is unclear or they don't have the right to reside in this country, at that point what we would be looking at is for a referral to the Children's Services at East Sussex County Council in this area, who would look to have a duty to assist those children. Yeah,
so they have a role to play for vulnerable people. What's the definition of vulnerable? Does that have a broad set of meanings, or who is it usually?
For single people, it means that normally it's around somebody's health. So their mental health, their physical health. The test for vulnerability has changed over the years, and it's become harder and harder to get people through that criteria. And I've been doing this job, as you have, Alan, for a number of years. And when I first started, all somebody had to have regarding their mental health was that they were linked in with their GP and they were on particular types of medication to help them. Nowadays, even if somebody is linked into the mental health services and they're seeing a psychiatrist, it can still be difficult to get them through that priority need category of being a vulnerable person. And it's about their vulnerability when they're street homeless. Because, most of us, even if, there are lots of people with mental health problems and health issues at the minute, and they will manage in accommodation, but they won't manage if they're on the street.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a huge increase at the moment in the number of people who are being placed in temporary accommodation, particularly we know in Eastbourne, but similar in other towns in the area. What's behind that? What's causing that?
There are lots of things, but I think one of the main drivers is the serving of Section 21 notices within the private rented sector. And there's lots of things going on in the background there. There's rising rents, landlords being able to charge more for their properties, and having people perhaps with who they've got living in their properties who they know can't afford to pay that rent, so they're ending those tenancies and then renting them to people that can afford those tenancies. There is a shortage of housing, so actually the market is buoyant for landlords in being able to pick and choose who they can have sort of in their properties. And people just finding it really difficult to access the private rented sector. And when you've got a market that's driven by economics and by money, it's really difficult for people who don't have access because they're either they're not working because they're unwell, or even families where both partners are working are finding it really difficult to access private rented accommodation.
Yeah, and that's what we see. We help people before they get to the point where they are served an eviction notice, and we have in the last year more and more people who simply phone up and say, my landlord wants to increase the rent by £350 a month starting straight away. What am I going to do? And those people don't have the spare income to be able to work with that, and therefore they're looking at an eviction notice that is going to either they're going to get into rent arrears, or they're going to start looking for other places to move to and find that very difficult. They might be in a tenancy agreement that has a fixed length of time, so they're sort of committed in a way to stay there, and it's very difficult to go straight into other private rented accommodation that easily. There's usually a queue of people applying to rent a place. And those rents are probably of the same kind of cost. And we're also talking about people who are on benefits where the rent is paid by housing benefit or now universal credit, but it's set at that level called the local housing allowance, which is a fixed amount that doesn't really follow the rental market as such, and hasn't been upgraded for quite some time to match that. But for those people, I mean, how do they manage to afford rents as they are now? How do they do that? The local housing allowance might be £100 below what the rent is. How do they do it?
Well, this is the difficulty, isn't it? It's because there is no money, and I know that for your organisation and for ours, we're always looking at people's income and seeing if there's any way at all they can increase that income. And for some people, there is no way. For some people, it means having to take on 2 jobs or 3 jobs just to keep the roof over their head, which I think is really difficult, especially if you've got children, to be able to sort of be, looking after them as well. And it just doesn't feel right that if you've got to do that, to be able to look after your family.
And we see people who are solely reliant on benefit income who aren't able to work, maybe because of ill health, and they're actually using the rest of their benefits money to make up that rent shortfall because they need to keep the roof over their head. But that means there's less money for food and utilities and everything else, and this is in the cost of living situation where those prices are going up for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's where we see more people, isn't it, actually attending food banks and local fridge places and stuff like that, where they're reliant on those, and it's not an emergency, it's every week. It's all the time. They can't survive all the time. And why doesn't the council have places to put people into of their own, of council housing? Isn't it straightforward for them to just say, well, you can come and live here? If only that were the case. I think the issue we've had, for a long, long time is we had the right to buy. So from the 80s when Margaret Thatcher introduced that. So, and that money was never used to replace council housing. We have had a bit of council housing building in Eastbourne recently, which is really good news, but it can't meet the need that we have. So, it's really difficult because once people get into social housing, particularly council housing locally or even housing association properties, they don't move. Why would you move?
Right.
You've got a secure tenancy. And the rent is lower unless you're in affordable rents with a housing association. It's more secure. It's better for you.
And those housing waiting lists, they're quite long now, so people can remain on those for years, and there's not going to be any movement. They simply wait until they sort of progress along that route. So there's a very limited supply of housing available for the council. So it's a difficult situation for the council to solve because they don't have the solution themselves. So they're turning to temporary accommodation. So who provides temporary accommodation?
Well, the council, Eastbourne Borough Council, does use some of its. They do provide some of it themselves, but there's a lot of it is provided by private companies. And I don't mean to be mean about those private companies, but they're making a lot of money out of temporary accommodation.
Right.
Because under the regulations, they can charge more for temporary accommodation than they would if it was privately rented directly to that family unit.
Yeah, so they would receive more for temporary accommodation than they would if it was paid under housing benefit.
Yep.
But is it any different? Is it better?
No.
So I'm asking that knowing that we've had people who've come to us and said, well, my landlord's evicting me now because he's going to start housing people under temporary accommodation because he doesn't say, but we know that's more lucrative. That's an odd one. I've never quite understood why temporary accommodation attracts the higher rate. It's in the regulations, and it's possibly because you have to be, as a landlord, you have to be available at short term to provide it. But you've also said that people are in temporary accommodation for months. Yeah,
but that's not how it used to be. I think that's the issue, isn't it? Is when the regulations were brought in, the move through was much quicker.
A quick turnover.
Yeah, turnover. Yeah. Whereas now, people are in it, they can be in temporary accommodation for years.
Yeah, so that whole term temporary accommodation is becoming a bit misleading and why is that? That's because people can't move on effectively. They can't move back into their own rented accommodation or find somewhere in the private rented sector or from the housing supply that the council have.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, they just, the affordability of private rented, as we've discussed, means that people can't access that. They may not, if they're on benefits, they may not even have a good credit rating. So certain private landlords are not going to see them as somebody that particularly that they would want to rent to, even though that's been outlawed.
Yeah,
they don't have to give a reason why they're saying no.
Yeah, we know that still goes on. Yeah. And there's various other requirements that the private rented sector would expect, like rent in advance or a guarantor, all of which can be quite challenging for people if they don't have that.
I think the council they work really hard to get people into privately rented, and they have all sorts of schemes that they work with private rented landlords to access. The issue is there isn't enough and it's too expensive.
Right. Yeah, and there's a huge amount of work that the council team do on that side of things, but it's a very congested market with and there isn't an obvious solution. People come to us to say, where can I find cheaper accommodation, as if we have a sort of magic list that we would bring out. And the fact is, it's all basically the same selection, really.
It is, and I can remember back, we're going back 20 years, but everybody was housed. There was a way for people would come, and we would have a list of landlords. Even single people that do find it even more difficult than families to find accommodation, I think. And you would be able to get them housed. That is not where we're at now.
I can remember that as well. I can remember ringing round, and you had some options that were going to be relatively straightforward. It's we've been doing this a long time, so that's a distant memory now. So.
It is, isn't it? One that the accommodation is. It's really difficult, especially when we do now have these private companies and private landlords who've shifted towards the temporary accommodation market. So actually that then takes that private rented accommodation out of the private rented sector. So even it's building up that logjam even more because there's nowhere to move to, because those properties are now being used for temporary accommodation.
One thing important to mention as we're going through this is I hear people say that the problem is caused by people coming over on boats. Is that the case?
No.
It's not, is it?
No.
It's not. And they are housed in a completely separate way by the Home Office and not part of the temporary accommodation mix.
No, they don't. They're not, when people come across on the boats, they're not eligible for assistance under the Housing Act. They're just not. So they're completely outside, and they are housed by the Home Office.
Right. Okay, well, just to get that clear, because I think it's one of those things, because we're trying to get back to why so many people are ending up in this situation, and why there are more people in temporary accommodation than there ever have been, and they're not able to move on effectively. So they're stuck in a kind of limbo. They're not in the home they used to be, maybe for years. They're in a place that's meant to be temporary, and it goes on, and they're regularly trying to find other places, and people are helping them. And what's it like for people when they're in temporary accommodation? That's leading you towards a huge generalisation.
I know. But it's really difficult because temporary accommodation can be all sorts of things, and for people it's traumatic. I mean, moving because you've chosen to move is traumatic.
Yeah, but being evicted is
when you've done nothing wrong, just because you're whatever the landlord served you with notice, is traumatic. You don't have a choice of where you end up. You are offered accommodation by the council. Please, if you ever are, don't refuse it. Get advice at that point, but don't refuse it. And your children might have to move school. They might have to travel to school, something that they've not had to do in the past. You may have been living near where you work. That may change. And sometimes, and not too many times now with Eastbourne, you might be placed out of area.
Right.
And that is traumatic.
Yeah. And some of the people placed in Eastbourne came from other towns where other local authorities have found that there are spaces here that they can house them in at short notice. So they are more displaced. That's one of the most difficult parts, to be placed in a town that you're not familiar with. You're taken away from all of that sort of structure that you're used to. You might have friends and family and people who used to look after the kids, etc. And now you're miles away. Yeah. And that sounds really unsettling for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Who helps people that are in temporary accommodation?
Well, there is the floating support service locally that will help people, because part of their role is to help people make sure they provide all the things that they need to when they go into temporary accommodation, but also sort of they look to help people to move on into private rented accommodation. The council workers themselves will also help people. They come to you and they come to us for advice and assistance with regards to their situation.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be the chair of the Temporary Accommodation Action Group for East Sussex when it was set up a few years ago. I got made the chair because I wasn't at the first meeting, and
I think we voted you.
Yeah, well, but it was really interesting, and what that does is bring together people from all of the different aspects around temporary accommodation with the aim of trying to improve it in all of those different ways. But one of the things I found interesting was, I mean, this will vary from one area to another, but there was all sorts of different agencies like CGL, who do drug and alcohol support, would have outreach workers who would go there for anybody who needs it, health workers going there, various different things, all trying to address the different needs that people might have. It also depends on the setting, because in Eastbourne we've got Jevington Gardens, which is a great big provider of temporary accommodation with about 80 flats. And then there are other smaller places, maybe hotels or B&Bs. So some people are all together in one place and they're easily accessible, and then other people are elsewhere. So there's a mixture. You can't provide the same services in every single location. So how do people find out about those? And there were all sorts of things, including activities for children out of school, and knowing where there are different activities around you where you can get support from, where you can go to exercise classes and mental health support and well-being generally. Now that was really interesting, but we can come back to that at some other point. And what's the standard of accommodation like generally? Another great generalisation.
A great generalisation, because I think it's different for different properties. I think some of them are quite okay. They're not necessarily as large as people would be used to, so they may have to share spaces that they wouldn't normally have shared as a family unit. But some of them are pretty abysmal, and we have seen cases through the office that you just think, what on earth is going on? Even knowing that how stretched the local authorities are is still not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're sort of over a barrel a bit in terms of needing to place all these people wherever they can. And that was part of the work that we did a few years ago, as we were talking to the local authorities about having a minimum standard for temporary accommodation, because when we looked at it, there is no minimum standard of what people can expect when they're in temporary accommodation. You're not necessarily guaranteed there's going to be carpets on the floors or a bed, or bedclothes or furniture, and those are just the basics that you would expect. You're paying taxpayers' money to house people there. You can expect the basics at least. And we agreed a thing called the Charter, which is on our website, and it's for the council to go and apply, and we think they've taken it further into service level agreements, and other local authorities have been able to pick it up. But it was an interesting thing to discover that there was no minimum standards. So like you say, we've seen shocking examples, things like infestation of bed bugs and things, of people showing us, and then us and other agencies finding charitable support to make stuff up. The food bank have packs that they give to people with cutlery and utility stuff, and we're often paying for bits and pieces that maybe somebody else should be paying for, but if we can find the funds to do it, we're just trying to solve the problem for the person. So something needs to be done. There is in contrast, there is a thing called the Decent Homes Standard. Does that still apply to types of rented accommodation?
I think the Decent Homes Standard is more for social housing.
Right.
And I know, for sort of the councils and housing association properties, because these are privately rented. Right. They might be on I don't know if they do lease them. I don't think they do private sector leasing in Eastbourne. But no, I mean, the private rented standards will come under what we see for, under Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act.
Right.
So we're, that's a bit... There is no legislation around temporary accommodation.
Yeah, and if it's due for a review, it seems like some of the solutions are relatively straightforward. It's just, we're not talking about anything fancy, or we're just talking about making sure the basics are there, because people didn't have access to the stuff. They might put stuff in storage very hurriedly, thinking we have to get out, we have to put this over there. They don't necessarily know what to bring. They haven't got those things available.
And I think that's the problem, isn't it? Because there is no standard. So one accommodation might have everything you need as a basic, and yet you'll go to another and there's nothing.
Yeah.
And because the councils are working really sort of up to the limit of where they can go with people and when they need to move them, sometimes they don't know where they're going to put them until the last minute. So they can't prepare that family for what they need to take with them. Yeah.
I mean, it's tricky for everybody involved. In the end, you have the family who are not in a position to argue, and like you say, they should accept housing because it is a roof over their head, and that's the most important thing. But at the same time, not having the basics is just making the situation worse.
Yeah, it does. It does make it so much worse for people.
And there are, like we say, there are some good places. There are some ones that go over and above. In the Temporary Accommodation Action Group, there were temporary accommodation providers, and some of them were really saying to the standard we were suggesting, can we go further? And we said, well, of course, you can do as well as you like within that. This is just the starting point. So there are places that are really trying hard to support the people who are there in every sense, make it a good kind of living experience.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's brief before they move into a home of their own, but if it's going to be longer term, it needs to be as comfortable as you would expect. I always used to think, what would you want for your mum if she was moving into a place like this? What would you expect?
Yeah.
But that's just a way of getting a sort of common sense approach to it.
It is. It's a really traumatic time. I know I've said that, but it is. I do understand, I appreciate where the local authorities, the councils are coming from, what they're having to deal with, and particularly because it must be day in, day out for them. Yeah. But these are still people's lives. We're still family units that have got to get through this. And I know from the tag work that you and other people did that a lot of the temporary accommodation providers actually did lots of training around how to work with people that were homeless and were vulnerable, which was really good, because it is about, like you say, making this as good as it can be for them. And that's what we'd really like to see. I think it's more difficult when those units are out on their own, and I think those tend to be where we see the issues.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's we see the best people come to the tag and share best practice and be open and interested in what everybody else is doing, and some borrowing bits from each other. But that's not everybody.
No.
And it's maybe trying to sort of link in, make it part of the obligation that if you're going to be a temporary accommodation provider, you need to look at the best practice and be linked into other things.
Yeah.
So we did talk about the problems that people have about moving into accommodation on their own, but that's down to a number of things, isn't it? Lack of available housing, with lots of people trying to rent privately. What's this definition of affordable housing? What does that really mean? I know,
it's because there's it's not councils, but it's housing association properties, that there's an affordable rent, but there's also social rents. And social rents are much cheaper. And affordable housing is based on private rented amounts. And I think it's 80%, but I might have got that wrong. So that when you'll see developments, private construction companies or whoever will be said that they have to build this amount of affordable rent properties for a housing association. But it's not affordable in the sense that we see for social housing rents.
Right. So if you were on benefits, you wouldn't be able to afford affordable housing?
If you were on benefits, you would probably, because it's housing association, you would get the full amount.
Right.
But it's if you ever wanted to go out to work,
right,
it's going to be difficult because
Okay.
it's not going to be covered by the local housing allowance.
right. Yeah, so people on lowest income are going to really struggle to afford the basics.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's just nothing else available
No.
that's at the lower rates. I mean, we had a volunteer who used to annually check what was available to rent and see how much she could find within the local housing allowance amounts, and I think the highest figure it got to was 1%.
Yeah.
1% of places advertised were available or affordable at that level. I think it went down from that, but it didn't have much further that it could go, and that's a shocking thing to come back with.
Yeah, I think it's, we've talked about this many times, but I think for me, the main thing is with rents being affordable and what happens if you go into social rents is that, you'll have two families, exactly the same makeup, more or less the same income, and you put one of them into a council property, a social rent, and they're fine. I'm not saying that they're rich or they're extravagant or anything, but they manage and they're okay. But you put that same family into a private rent, and their rent will take up a huge amount of their income. They probably will be entitled to universal credit housing costs, but that's not going to cover that shortfall between the local housing allowance and their rent. So they're already starting at a disadvantage. And that family can struggle. And yet you get, that other family will be fine. And they've got the security of tenure to go along with it as well.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. The unsettling nature of being in rented accommodation short term and having to move frequently is a very different thing to how you and I grew up in places. This sounds like a really complicated and slightly gloomy picture that we're painting about the whole situation. But what do you think are the kind of solutions that are needed for this?
Well, it is really. I think there's no one solution. I don't think we can say that. I think there are a number of things that we could look at. There is the fact that we need to build more affordable housing. We also need to bring empty homes back into use. There are lots of empty homes. I think I was reading recently that if all the empty homes were brought back into use in the country, that would go quite a long way to solving issues.
I saw somewhere that in Eastbourne there are 1,000 empty homes, which is amazing.
It is
because
amazing.
I might see one or two, but that's a place where people, who are in temporary accommodation could find homes to stay in permanently, if ideally that would be the...
I think the difficulty we have with that is there would need to be a change around the legislation about how you make somebody bring that property back into use. But why can't we do that? And the other issue, which people might not like, is that we do have a lot of Airbnb, holiday homes, second homes, and we only have to, it's quite often in the news, and you see it even, recently in Spain and places like that, where they're saying we've got over tourism, our houses are all being used for holiday homes, we can't access housing, so our situation is being, we can see it being replicated elsewhere. And we'd see it in Cornwall and Devon, don't we, where whole villages, there's hardly any actual residents. Yeah,
that really resonates for people here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So,
And I'm not saying it's as bad as that in Eastbourne, but, it depends how... Do we really want to solve this housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also things that might have been brought into a sort of stark light in the cost of living situation where day-to-day life has become unaffordable in a number of different ways. And you add up all those different ways for people who are on the lowest income, and they're going to get into rent arrears, they're going to get into debt of other kinds. The housing situation is not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be safe, and all it takes is one kind of change, like an increase in the rent, and it all unravels. So you do need the housing solutions, but you need something which is going to make life more affordable generally. I don't know whether we never talk about increases in inflation as if they're just going to be short-lived and then it'll all go back to how it was. These prices have all gone up, but don't worry, they'll all come back down once we get through this global problem or whatever it is. And that's what makes these things more difficult to solve, because they just keep sort of piling up. But this is national government's
it is
job to address a bit of all of this. I think that's what we're describing there is just sort of day-to-day life of what we deal with in our office. This is affecting so many different people, and both our teams are challenged with trying to come up with solutions, and the options get sort of narrower and narrower for people, really, and we do our best and we make a lot of difference for a lot of people, but there's a lot of stuff that we can't solve. We can just try and smooth the way. Bigger changes are needed elsewhere to do that. Yeah,
definitely. With it, we can't make this right. We can't. We don't have the power to change these big structural issues that we have as a country.
No, absolutely. I mean, contrary to popular belief, we don't have magic wands that we bring out to solve in these sort of situations.
But I think we can honestly say, for both of us, if housing was not an issue, we could go off and do another job, but we can't, because actually it is an issue.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, there's a job to be done in trying to address these kind of root causes and to campaign about them and to bring them out into the open so that people understand them a bit better. And that's regardless of what kind of situation we're in. We've always been doing that. We've always been talking to whoever's in power and saying, this is going on, it needs something to prevent other people from having exactly the same problem. And I think that's one of the things about housing is that it can affect anybody. Most people live very close to their means, and all you need is some unexpected change of circumstances and people's housing becomes at risk. It's the one thing that you need stability with to build your life around, but it's not that straightforward anymore, and that means people who are well off or comfortable could still be close to being at risk if things, unexpectedly, the illness, relationship breakdown, loss of a job, all of a sudden everything is up in the air, and that's a very worrying thing for a lot of people. Well, I think we've got pretty much to the end of the subject, so thank you, Sue. That's been a good